Thank you, Patrick, and thank you all for being here. I always enjoy visiting Lancaster history. It's such a fine place that Tom and Patrick and others have put together here. As Patrick mentioned, tonight I'll be talking about John Brown, James Buchanan, and the Harper's Ferry raid of October of 1859. I should add, before I get started, that when one talks about the Harper's Ferry raid, John Brown is somebody who really is the center of the story. James Buchanan isn't, but of course, because James Buchanan lived next door to this place, his views regarding the Harper's Ferry raid are of some relevance, particularly since he was the U.S. president when the Harper's Ferry raid occurred. So, beginning with John Brown. John Brown was born in Torrington, Connecticut in May of 1800. And thereafter, he moved with his family to Ohio. He spent some time also as a young adult living in Pennsylvania, and then eventually moved to Massachusetts. Brown's life was one that, or at least his young adulthood and up through the time he was in his 40s, was one that was characterized by moving around a lot. Somebody who never really achieved financial success, but that said, Brown never considered himself a failure, and always seemed to be somebody who felt as though he was guided by some larger and greater purpose. Brown lived in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, for a few years, where he worked as a tanner. His time in Crawford County is one that's marked by this historical marker, as you can see here. Brown was married twice. His first wife died in 1832, who bore 7 children, 5 of whom lived to adulthood. Brown's second wife, Mary Ann Day, bore 13 children, 6 of whom reached adulthood. And of course, I'm sure you all can do the math. 20 children. John Brown was a busy guy, obviously. So Brown ended up securing property in northern New York, a place called North Elba, in 1848 from abolitionist Gerrit Smith. And Gerrit Smith was making land available to African Americans in an area that wasn't the best farming area in the country. Even today, in our warmer climate, Essex County, New York is a colder place than central Pennsylvania throughout the winter. Eventually, Brown moved his family there in 1855. This house, which still stands, is where Brown lived. The photograph was taken in the late 19th century. In the foreground, one can see John Brown's gravestone. Should add that the John Brown farm itself is today a state historic site, and in one of those odd coincidences that some of us just think have to be noted because it is such an odd coincidence. Brown's property in North Elba is adjacent to the town of Lake Placid, New York, the site of the 1980 Winter Olympics. The marker you see in the foreground is one that notes the transfer of Brown's property to the state of New York in 1896. And the background is the Olympic ski jump. If you watch the 1980 Olympics on television, you would have seen this ski jump, and the fact that that's still there is still bewildering, even though it's nonetheless the case. So why is it that John Brown opposed slavery? Many Americans opposed slavery in the 19th century, and many Americans, white Americans, supported slavery. Slaveholders did, and others who were not slaveholders and maybe hoped to become slaveholders supported slavery as well. Reasons for Brown's opposition to slavery seem to be rooted in many cases, many ways, in the life of Brown's father. Owen Brown was himself a noted opponent of slavery, and Owen Brown's views undoubtedly influenced those of his son. This is probably the earliest photograph we have of John Brown. It shows Brown with his hand extended. Perhaps he's swearing allegiance to a flag. Some people have suggested that it may be a flag, an anti-slavery flag. The photographer, Augustus Washington, was an early African-American photographer, and in 1846, photography was still very new. Now, as we look at this photograph a little more carefully, we can see Brown's eyes very clearly. It's easy to look back in retrospect and say that one can see in Brown's eyes a determination, though it may well be that Augustus Washington just simply said to John Brown, "Stand still and don't move while I'm taking this photo." It's hard to know in retrospect. But Brown himself was a religious and political nonconformist. He never belonged to an abolitionist organization. And he was also a religious nonconformist and spent most of his life, adult life, not belonging or being formally connected to any religious body. But during the 1830s and 1840s, Brown began to establish himself as a determined opponent of slavery. He assisted many fugitives from enslavement from where he lived in Ohio. And by the 1840s, by the mid-1840s or so, becomes clear that Brown began to believe that the only way to end slavery would possibly be through violence. Brown met Frederick Douglass by 1847, and at this time, Brown had begun to conceive of a plan which he called a subterranean passageway, which he said could be the means of bringing large numbers of enslaved people from the slave states to the free states, or possibly even to Canada, if they could all move through the Allegheny Mountains. It didn't really define what this subterranean passageway happened to be, but he imagined this great movement occurring. All that really had to happen in Brown's mind was that enslaved people needed to know that there was a way, and in Brown's mind, they also needed a leader, and it's quite clear that Brown saw himself as that leader who might indeed be making that happen. And I should also add along those same lines that as we look at Brown during the 1830s and 1840s, one thing that's clear about Brown is he was a committed proponent of African-American equality. By the 1840s, Brown had found that he had been expelled from a church that he hadn't attended for some time, largely because he had moved away. And Brown was convinced that the reason he had been expelled was because he made clear to an African-American family that they could have his pew seat, and that the white members of that congregation objected to that fact. So in the mid-1850s, the attention of many Americans was focused on the newly created territory of Kansas. Kansas had been under the jurisdiction of the United States since the United States bought the land in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But since 1803, the area of Kansas and Nebraska were what contemporary Americans referred to as unorganized territory. That meant that there was no political authority there save the presence of the United States Army, and indigenous populations continue to live there in fairly large numbers. But in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was signed into law by President Franklin Pierce. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to settlement, and did so with the understanding that the white settlers of those territories would choose for themselves whether they would be protecting slavery by law or not. And so many settlers began moving to Nebraska and Kansas because they were interested in getting land that the United States government was selling for $1.25 an acre. And 5 of Brown's sons went to Kansas with that in mind. Brown considered going to Kansas, but decided to stay back for a while. But when his 5 sons went to Kansas, and they had arrived there by the spring of 1855, Brown's sons, who held strong anti-slavery convictions like their father, complained of pro-slavery settlers and the threats of violence from pro-slavery settlers. Because as Kansas in particular was opened to white settlement, it drew a lot of settlers from southern states and from northern states who were eager to get the cheap land that was there. Settlers from slave states had hoped to make Kansas into a slave state, and based on the thinking that many Americans had about the issue at the time, they believed that Kansas just may have been one of the last places in the United States where plantation-style slavery could continue to exist, say, as it did in parts of Missouri, which was a slave state and just across the border from this newly created territory of Kansas. Brown's sons wrote to Brown complaining about their fears of violence, and consequently, Brown decided that he would go to Kansas himself, and he arrived there in October of 1855. By the spring of 1856, circumstances in Kansas became a lot more serious. On May 21st, 1856, the Free State Settlement, and by calling it a Free State Settlement, it means that it was that Lawrence was a settlement that was populated by settlers from the Free States. Settlers from slave states went into Lawrence, destroyed a number of public buildings, destroyed a newspaper and printing press, destroyed what's called the Free State Hotel. And this marked the beginnings of a series of violent acts that occurred in Kansas during the mid-1850s that contemporaries have since referred to as Bleeding Kansas. Brown himself responded to these events of so-called Bleeding Kansas by participating in and essentially orchestrating what became known as the Potawatomi Massacre. Brown, some of his sons, and a number of other Free State settlers attacked 5 pro-slavery settlers in the night of May 24th, 1856. The Potawatomi Massacre, as it soon became known, was something that was much talked about across the country. Though Brown's complicity in the Potawatomi Massacre was not something that he ever acknowledged during his lifetime. It wasn't really until some 20 years after Brown's death that documentary evidence came out, making it clear that Brown himself was not only involved in these killings, but that he really was very much the instigator of them. These killings occurred through the use of broadswords. The thinking is that Brown and his accomplices committed these acts of violence with broadswords because killing with the use of guns would create too much noise in the plains of Kansas, where the trees were few and where the land was relatively flat. Thereafter, a series of other confrontations between Free State settlers and Slave State settlers occurred. This one comes from the Blackjack battlefield, of which Brown himself participated, as also this one, the Osawatomie battlefield. These conflicts occurred in the spring and summer of 1856. Brown himself's role in the Battle of Osawatomie led to him having the nickname of Osawatomie Brown really up till the time of the Harper's Ferry incident that we'll be getting to here in just a few moments. Now, some people have questioned whether the amount of bloodshed in Kansas really makes the term Bleeding Kansas maybe a bit of an exaggeration. Quantitatively, we can say that it's estimated that about 56 people died during the mid to late 1850s in acts of political violence in Kansas. And this was in a population that numbered in the tens of thousands. Regardless, the affairs in Kansas focused national attention on slavery, and it became widely known that Brown himself was involved in these acts of violence. He was an anti-slavery believer, an abolitionist, who did more than just talk. He took the fight to the other side. And these bold actions of Brown led to him receiving some financial support from a number of individuals who lived in the northeastern United States that have since become known as the Secret Six. The Secret Six provided Brown with some money to fund some of his activities during the late 1850s, though it's also clear that these individuals really weren't fully aware of everything that Brown was involved doing. By 1858, Brown had made it clear that he had plans to make a direct attack on Southern slavery. He revealed this at a clandestine meeting in Chatham, Ontario, at a church that was predominantly African American. He wanted to make a sustained attack on Southern slavery, and at this time, Brown was looking for contributions. He was looking for people who might offer some financial support. And he was also as well looking for volunteers. Perhaps the most notable success of Brown in terms of attacking slavery before Harper's Ferry occurred in December of 1858. At that point, Brown went back to Kansas, crossed over into Missouri, and attacked several plantations with his accomplices, resulting in the liberation of 11 enslaved people. Then he essentially escorted these 11 freed individuals across Iowa into Illinois, where they caught a train that took them to Detroit, and from Detroit they crossed over into Canada. Brown's actions were ones, however, that caught people's attention. People knew that John Brown was involved in these activities. The Buchanan administration knew about it as well and offered a $250 reward for Brown's capture. Brown himself, when learning about it, said that he would give $5 to anybody who could deliver James Buchanan to any prison or jail in the United States. Neither John Brown nor the Buchanan administration ever had to pay out on either of these offers. But because Brown knew he was a fugitive, he began donning a beard during the last 2 years of his life. Otherwise, Brown was a clean-shaven person. But during these last few years, because Brown knew that he was a wanted man, he wore a beard. He went by several different names that were not John Brown as a way of being able to move freely and trying to avoid any kind of suspicion. Eventually, Brown began to focus on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, a place that was close to Pennsylvania, where Brown saw that he might be able to do some of the organization preparatory to making a larger attack on Harper's Ferry. So what was it then that John Brown hoped to accomplish by attacking the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia? In a letter that John Brown wrote to his son, John Brown Jr., in February of 1858, he wrote, "I have been thinking," as he writes, John Brown writes to his son, John Brown Jr., "that I would like to have you make a trip to Bedford, Chambersburg, Gettysburg, and Uniontown in Pennsylvania, traveling with them as much as you could. When you look at the location of these places, you will readily perceive the advantage of getting up some acquaintance in those parts." Here, Brown rather vaguely, clandestinely even, is pointing to the raid that he would eventually make at Harper's Ferry. Telling his son, John Brown Jr., look at those places and get a sense of where one might go from those places towards Harper's Ferry. In the end, Brown settled upon Chambersburg and spent much of the summer of 1859 in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where he stored weapons. This house in Chambersburg, known as the John Brown House or the Mary Rittner House in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, is, like many of the sites that we're pointing to today, designated by a state historical marker. Brown had pikes delivered, had 950 pikes manufactured and delivered to Chambersburg, pikes that were presumably paid for through the contributions of people who were supporting John Brown and also the Secret Six, to whom we alluded to earlier. Brown apparently wanted to take these pikes, give them to people who were enslaved in the Harper's Ferry area, and use them as part of the larger attack upon the institution of slavery. When John Brown was in Chambersburg, he was visited by who was at this point an old friend, Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass visited John Brown for about 2.5 days. And he was accompanied by an individual named Shields Green, an African American who was traveling with Frederick Douglass. While there, for about 3 days, Brown and Douglass debated the attack that Brown had planned for Harper's Ferry. Brown saw Douglass as a natural leader. He was convinced that enslaved people would flock to Douglass as and his charismatic presence, and Douglass could be the tool of launching a greater insurrection against slavery. Douglass said to Brown, "You're crazy." Which is a way of saying you're being really foolish. Enslaved people won't rise up the way you think they will. You're walking into a perfect trap. Don't do it. They went back and forth like this for about 2.5 days. And when Brown and Douglass prepared to depart, the last time they would ever see each other, the African-American man, Shields Green, who had come with Douglass and who had listened to this debate, decided that he would go with Douglass or with Brown. Shields Green ultimately found John Brown to be more persuasive than Frederick Douglass. And the meeting between Douglass and Brown, located on US 30 in Chambersburg. During the summer of 1859, Brown and his allies began spending time 5 miles from Harper's Ferry in Maryland at a place known as the Kennedy Farm. This was a gathering point for Brown and his allies to be before launching the attack on Harper's Ferry. Most of the time at the Kennedy Farm, Brown's allies spent their time indoors. They didn't want people to see 15 or 20 men just kind of doing military exercises in the yard in broad daylight. The Kennedy Farm is in even today in a fairly remote area and doesn't necessarily get a lot of traffic on the road, but 20 people surrounding a house that's not built for 20 was something that would have aroused the suspicions of neighbors. Brown's allies stayed inside all day, and as they stayed inside, kind of waiting for things to happen, Brown's daughter and his daughter-in-law, Annie Brown and Martha Brewster Brown, spent more than 2 months there doing the cooking and cleaning necessary to keep large numbers of men fed and keeping the place from looking what would have otherwise, I can imagine, be something like a bad dorm room at the end of an academic year, with so many people living in very close quarters to one another. Now, as all this is happening, it's estimated nowadays that there was probably 100 or 200 people who would have known about the events of Harper's Ferry before they occurred. Besides Brown and his 21 accomplices, there were his family members, some of the family members of these individuals, people that Brown had wanted to join but didn't, and eventually rumors began circulating. One individual wrote to the Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, saying that there was a plan underfoot to attack a U.S. armory the report was that it was going to be in Maryland. Well, of course, Harper's Ferry was on the Maryland border, and the person sending this note came from Iowa. But Floyd said, "This is foolish," just kind of discarded it. But there was a small buzz circulating in some quarters regarding this expected attack on Harper's Ferry. This photograph comes from 2009. This illustration is from 1859. This illustration from 1859 shows the railroad that went through Harper's Ferry, the rivers that defined Harper's Ferry, and for that matter, the hillsides or mountains that went through the region. The Appalachian Trail, as many of you may know, goes through Harper's Ferry. And this National Park Service map shows Harper's Ferry being where the Shenandoah River of Virginia and West Virginia meets the Potomac River. And the Shenandoah River is a tributary of the Potomac River. It's a site renowned for its beauty. Thomas Jefferson wrote in his notes on the states of Virginia that the scene at Harper's Ferry, and he's writing about this in the 18th century, decades before the events we're discussing were occurring. Jefferson said, "The view here is worth a voyage all across the Atlantic," and some people would say that it still is. Brown and his men launched the attack on Harper's Ferry on October 16th, 1859. There were, besides Brown, 21 men in the attack on the Federal Arsenal and Armory. Of those individuals, 17 were white, 5 were African American. We don't have time to go through these individuals today, but I've placed their photographs in this particular slide. When Harper's Ferry residents awoke in the morning of October 17th, they found that their town was under attack, and a number of these of Harper's Ferry residents essentially grabbed their weapons and began shooting at Brown and his accomplices, who at that time were spread out over much of Harper's Ferry. Eventually, Brown and several of his allies and a number of hostages went to a place at the site known as the Engine House. And from the Engine House, Brown and his allies could shoot back at the people who were shooting at them, and at the same time feel as though they could provide some protection for the hostages that they had taken. This modern photograph of the Engine House is of a building that has its own lengthy story. In brief, the Engine House you can see is in the background, but the gray obelisk that's in the foreground marks the site of where the Engine House once had been. After 1859, the Engine House became a tourist site, place frequently visited. Individuals would come and grab bricks from the Engine House, take them away as souvenirs. And then eventually, the Engine House was taken apart, moved to Chicago, put on display in 1992 to 93 at the World Columbian Exposition there. Then when it came back to Harper's Ferry, it stood for some time on a local farm before spending more than half a century at an African-American college that used to exist in Harper's Ferry called Storer College. And since 1968, it's been on its present location, but not on its original location. This contemporary illustration shows Brown, his hostages inside the engine house, with Brown's allies firing at local militia. Eventually, a contingent of U.S. Marines led by U.S. Officers Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, who at that time were still wearing the uniform of the United States. They directed these Marines to break down the doors using this very sturdy ladder as a battering ram. They made their way into the engine house quickly, rapidly subdued Brown and his men. And the incident at Harper's Ferry at that point had come to an end. The casualties were ones that were very quickly recognized. There were 10 raiders killed in the attack. 7 who were captured were later executed by the state of Virginia. 5 of Brown's accomplices or allies ended up escaping. There were 6 Harper's Ferry residents who were killed, 9 Harper's Ferry residents were wounded, and 1 U.S. Marine was himself killed in the engine house attack. Brown obviously had hoped that the enslaved people of Harper's Ferry would respond favorably to Brown's arrival. Jefferson County, Virginia, had an enslaved population of about 27% in 1860. It was the county that became the state of West Virginia that had the highest proportion of its population enslaved. But the enslaved population of Harper's Ferry and its vicinity generally did not rise up the way that Brown had expected them to. There were some reports of unexplained fires, some reports also of some individuals taking advantage of the confusion and seeking freedom themselves. But the general uprising among the local enslaved population that Brown wanted to occur was something that did not happen. Perhaps an indicator of Frederick Douglass's thoughts and his expectations on this matter from a few months earlier. But how is it that President James Buchanan responded to this raid at Harper's Ferry? Well, there's a few things that we can say. Buchanan heard about it the morning of October 17th through exaggerated press reports. He thereafter met with his War Secretary, John Floyd, the same guy who said, there's nothing wrong going on here. Don't worry about it. The War Secretary, John Floyd, ordered Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Jeb Stuart to lead a detachment of Marines to Harper's Ferry. The following day, on October 18th, Buchanan spent hours conferring with Floyd, with Secretary of State Lewis Cass regarding Harper's Ferry. And then he sent the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Robert Ould, who's depicted on the right, to the Harper's Ferry region to collect additional information. Because the raid had occurred on federal property, and because it was U.S. Marines who ultimately brought Brown, who subdued Brown and his allies. This was obviously a federal matter with a clear federal jurisdictional question. But at the same time, there was also the question of the state of Virginia. Virginia Governor Henry A. Wise insisted that Brown and his allies be tried in Virginia courts rather than in a federal court. And while he arguably wanted this, one could easily add for political purposes, it's perhaps easy to see that Buchanan would have wanted this case to be tried in Virginia for political purposes of his own. Regardless, Buchanan relented to Wise, and the story of John Brown's prosecution is one that is covered by the Virginia courts. Brown was tried in Charlestown, West Virginia, the county seat of Jefferson County, not to be confused with Charleston, West Virginia, which is in a different part of the state. The Jefferson County Courthouse, where John Brown was tried, continues to stand to the present, and likewise, a historical marker is present there as well. John Brown was captured on the 18th. He was arraigned in court in Charlestown a week later on October the 25th, and his trial began 2 days later on October the 27th. You'll notice that in the center of this illustration, let's see if I can get this, you can see Brown lying in a cot. Brown sustained wounds that were not life-threatening when U.S. Marines subdued Brown and his raiders at the engine house attack, and he was still recovering from those wounds. So when he appeared in court, he was there on a cot because it wasn't easy for him to sit in a chair during this time. Brown's mind, though, was clear. He was able to participate in the proceedings. He was able to speak clearly. He just was doing so from a cot. Brown consulting with his legal counsel, again from a cot. The court sequestered Brown's jurors during the trial. Half of the jury were slaveholders, and they found Brown guilty on October 31st, 1859, after deliberating for 45 minutes. The jurors found Brown guilty of treason against the state of Virginia, perhaps a questionable charge. It would have been easier perhaps to have prosecuted Brown for treason against the United States. Brown and his accomplices, his allies, were not residents of the state of Virginia, but that didn't keep the jury from convicting him on that charge, but also of murder and inciting slave rebellion, which for white Virginians was probably the most serious charge. This illustration shows Brown as he rose to address the court for his sentencing on November 2nd, 1859. On this occasion, Brown said, "I believe to have interfered in behalf of his," speaking of God there, "despised poor was not wrong but right. Now if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." Brown was sentenced to hang, and the judge, Richard Parker, slated the execution for Brown to be on December the 2nd, 1859. Brown's capture, prosecution, conviction, and sentencing all occurred within a very, very brief window of time. And in the last month of his life, Brown wrote many letters. He submitted himself to large numbers of interviews. And in this process, Brown ended up creating a lot of sympathy, largely because many people said, well, regardless of what you think about John Brown, he's somebody who followed through with what he really believed in. And many of Brown's detractors, including Virginia Governor Henry A. Wise, who wanted Brown prosecuted in Virginia, executed in Virginia, walked away from his meeting with John Brown being impressed. He said, "This guy's not crazy. He holds foolish ideas," but Brown was not cowed or intimidated by in his conversation with the governor of Virginia, who could have probably done Brown some favors if he had wanted to, though Wise had no intention of doing anything of that sort. Worried that there would be an attack upon the jail, authorities took extreme security precautions, prohibited strangers from being present. Among those who were impressed by Brown was a Maryland actor known as John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth, who became famous for other reasons not worth mentioning at this point, went ahead and bought a uniform, joined the Virginia militia, traveled to Charlestown on his own expense just to witness Brown's execution. He despised Brown's actions, but admired Brown's character and that sense of an individual following through and simply acting on what he believed was right carries with it an obvious eerie foreboding to the reasons that made John Wilkes Booth famous. This 19th century painting shows Brown going to his execution, kissing an African-American child while being surrounded by Virginia militia. John Brown's last note, which he handed to his jailer on while he was en route to his execution December 2nd of 1859, notes that I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had once vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. The streets of Charlestown were lined with members of the Virginia militia. Brown went to the scaffold where he was then executed on December 2nd. The site of John Brown's execution, again marked by a historical marker. Brown's accomplices were themselves executed on December 16th and 1859 and March 16th of 1860. Brown was thereafter transported to Elba, New York for burial. Now, just 17 days after Brown's execution, President James Buchanan referred to the Harper's Ferry incident in his national message to the United States, which he delivered to Congress. He says, I shall not refer in detail to the recent sad and bloody occurrences at Harper's Ferry. These events derive their chief importance from the apprehension that they are but symptoms of an incurable disease in the public mind, which may break out in some more dangerous outrages and terminate at last in an open war by the North to abolish slavery in the South. Buchanan said he entertained no such apprehension because he firmly believed that the events at Harper's Ferry, by causing the people to pause and reflect upon the possible peril to their cherished institutions, will be the means under Providence of allaying the existing excitement and preventing further outbreaks of a similar character. Brown's sanguine hopes that he expressed in 1859 regarding sectional reconciliation obviously soon disappeared. Writing in his memoir, which was published just after the Civil War concluded, Buchanan opined, in the already excited condition of public feeling throughout the South, the raid of John Brown made a deeper impression on the Southern mind against the Union than all former events. John Brown's legacy, though, is one that James Buchanan really didn't define, and it's one that began to play out during the Civil War itself. This illustration from 1865 shows the African-American regiment, the 55th Massachusetts, marching through Charleston, South Carolina, being greeted by Charleston's enslaved population as liberating heroes. According to the news account, the soldiers were singing the Civil War marching song, John Brown's Body. And perhaps it's easy to imagine that John Brown would have liked to have been greeted in this fashion when he went to Harper's Ferry in 1859. But individuals were indeed greeted this way in 1865. A number of artists have memorialized Brown in a number of notable ways. Jacob Lawrence, an important 20th century American artist, created a series of paintings that focus on the life of John Brown, some of which I've shown here today. The Mexican artist and muralist Diego Rivera created a number of murals that likewise feature John Brown as a revolutionary hero. This painting that's in the Kansas State House in Topeka shows Brown with his outstretched arms, with a gun in one hand, a Bible in the other, obviously assuming a figure of Christ at the crucifix, with a warring nation behind him, with fire and tornadoes off in the distance, with bodies on the ground. These paintings speak to the complicated legacy of John Brown. Persistent questions raised by the Harper's Ferry raid include the following. When is it appropriate to use violence to destroy injustice? Did slavery as a labor system that depended upon violence for its survival deserve to be overthrown with violence? And was the Civil War worth more than 750,000 deaths and 400,000 wounded so that 4 million enslaved people might be free? The early 20th century poet, Stephen Vincent Benet, put these matters in another way. As he wrote, the laws are a yardstick and it measures well, or well enough when there are yards to measure. Measure a wave with it, measure a fire. Cut sorrow up in inches, weigh content. You can weigh John Brown's body well enough, but how and in what balance weigh John Brown? Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Folks, if you have a question that you'd like to ask John, please raise your hand.
Okay. What happened to his wife and his sons?
Well, some of his sons died at Harper's Ferry. John Brown's wife eventually immigrated to California. She only lived in North Elba for a few years thereafter. One of her sons, Watson Brown, moved to Pasadena, California. And in fact, there's a marker in the mountains above Pasadena that indicates where Owen Brown was himself eventually buried. And it's something of a local mark of significance. But remember, Brown had 20 children, 13 of whom lived to adulthood. Watson Brown, I should add, was the last of the Harper's Ferry raiders to have survived. He was among the 5 who made their way to freedom.
On the raid on Harper's Ferry, was there ever any intent on Brown's behalf to take the Armory?
Well, I don't think he really was concerned about taking control of the place that was making the weapons. He wanted to get the weapons that were there and distribute those weapons among enslaved people and other allies. And that's something that in the end did not really work out. Brown himself was obviously not a good strategist. And Douglas was somebody who could see that. But he was extremely good during that last month and a half or so of his life of stating his case when he had the world's attention. And Brown's, in many respects, everything of his 59 years kind of distilled into the raid at Harper's Ferry and the time between his capture on October 18th and his execution on December the 2nd. During that time, Brown's able to communicate to the world what his views were regarding slavery. And in death, he ended up getting perhaps a lot more than he ever would have in life.
I read somewhere that that some of the hostages that John Brown had in the Armory, that he was, instead of killing them, trying to convert them up until the last minute.
Yeah, he was. Brown himself was very solicitous of his hostages, and it's believed he had about 30 hostages there. One of them was George Washington's nephew, and when he was there and he went to the nephew's house, who lived just outside of Harper's Ferry, and abducted this individual along with some historical artifacts of interest, brought them with him to Harper's Ferry. One of the reasons that Brown probably had a chance to escape early in the morning of the 17th, when he realized that this wasn't working out the way that he wanted to. But he stated that the reason he didn't escape because he was concerned about the hostages. He didn't want people to think that he was just a bloodthirsty guy. He wanted to see to it that the hostages were delivered to safety. So if you're so, of course, that raises the question, if you're so concerned about the safety of hostages, why take hostages in the first place? But that's another matter.
Okay, we have a question from Zoom. Is there any evidence of Buchanan's Vice President, John Breckinridge, having been involved in the discussions or actions around Harper's Ferry?
Buchanan was not close to his vice president. The presidency and vice presidency operated a lot differently in the 19th century than it does today. Breckinridge was not really a partner in the Buchanan administration. The two were not close. Buchanan supported Breckinridge's candidacy for presidency in 1860, but he did not play a deliberative role in the Buchanan administration.
I was curious how a historian would be able to get pictures that old, particularly of some people that seem to be relatively insignificant in this whole story, like the daughters of John Brown, and know that those photographs were John Brown's daughters. I mean, just how would you know that?
I guess the short version of that is that John Brown, after Harper's Ferry, never vanished into anonymity. And people wanted to know Brown's story. And the elements of John Brown's life were ones that ended up being preserved. So today we have a lot more photographs than people did, 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, for that matter. That's not something that would have been difficult to do. And in fact, the earliest biographers of John Brown were working on things, identifying photographs and stuff, while many of these individuals were still alive. Well, I'm sorry, I missed it.
He's asking if the pictures were printed on paper. Were they glass negatives?
Well, True confession, I've never looked at the originals. So I can't really tell you anything about the originals of these photographs themselves. And because they're so widely distributed nowadays, there's people who refer to Brown usually use them for illustrative purposes rather than studying some of the questions that are of interest to you. So I can't really answer.
One of the things that your presentation has helped remind me this evening is the relatively short period of time between Kansas and Harper's Ferry.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right. What was the earliest that Brown actually espoused or endorsed the use of the kind of violence that he exhibited in Kansas and Harper's Ferry?
Well, his first use of violence was in Potawatomi. And I should add that the people who knew Brown said that such acts of violence were entirely contrary to Brown's nature, because he was not somebody who came across as a violent person. And he didn't stand out, even with the family of as many children as he had, of being somebody who used violence to keep things in order any more than men would have done in the 19th century. And he may have even been more passive than some. But as far as expressing the need for violence to overthrow slavery, Brown appears to have sort of come to that conclusion by sometime in the 1840s. It's a question that it's been of interest to Brown scholars. When does Brown espouse violence? And part of the problem is that we have pretty good documentation for Brown's life from 1855 onward, and even more so during the last year of his life. But we don't have as much information about the evolution of Brown's anti-slavery thinking during the 1830s and 1840s. We never really have Brown explaining why he chose to oppose slavery, other than giving a biblical justification that it's right to side with the poor and the despised. Those early years of Brown's life, and I say early years really before 1855, when he was already 55 years old, are things that the information is something that we just kind of have to put together through a number of sources and in the end make some inferences.
Another question from Zoom. So after the raid, did the United States step up their security on any other armories or forts to protect and prevent other attacks?
Well, it's funny you should ask. John Buchanan Floyd later became a Confederate general and was a general was still Secretary of War after Lincoln's election and in the closing months of Buchanan's administration. Some contemporaries charge that Floyd began moving weapons in United States armories and arsenals from places that were in free states to areas within slave states, so that they might be used by Confederate forces, while he was still a member of the Buchanan administration for the government of the United States. Now, Brown was convicted of treason against the state of Virginia. John Buchanan Floyd, if that's not treason against the United States, I don't know what is.
To what extent do you think the actions of John Brown, or the legacy that he sort of built in that last month of his life, precipitate the start of the Civil War?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because a lot of people who study John Brown's life to the exclusion of other things will speak of John Brown as a person who sparked the Civil War. I think the documentary evidence on that point makes that conclusion unsustainable. largely because everybody's talking about John Brown from the time of the Harper's Ferry raid till the time of his death. And still in December of 1859, James Buchanan, in his annual address, begins with Harper's Ferry. But afterwards, and even more so after the execution of Brown's accomplices, John Brown is something that kind of disappears from the map of Americans. You don't see many references to John Brown throughout 1860. You don't see many references to John Brown during the secession crisis. When Confederate states voted to leave the Union, they usually listed their reasons for leaving the Union. None of them mentioned John Brown, but they all mentioned such things as the election of Lincoln. The election of Lincoln was for white Southerners who supported the Confederacy a sufficient reason to leave the Union. They complained about how northern states were not enforcing fugitive slave acts. That was also a justifiable reason to secede from the Union. They complained about the existence and persistence of anti-slavery societies, not mentioning John Brown at all, that had been going on for decades, that white Northerners had done nothing to stop, all of which threatened the institution of slavery. When it comes to the causes of the Civil War, I think it's very easy to overstate John Brown's significance in that way. I'm of the view that that the story of John Brown is kind of an episodic one that brings a lot of issues into high relief, but like so many other things, sort of leaves our attention span as soon as we're attracted to other things. And when political parties are issuing their platforms in 1860, neither Democratic Party, the Northern Democratic Party or the Southern Democratic Party, the Constitutional Union Party mentions Harper's Ferry. The Republican Party does, but only to condemn it. And so as a way of saying, hey, we're not going to attack the institution of slavery, which reassurances didn't go very far after Lincoln's election. So as I said, glad you asked that point. And I've had discussions with people who are absolutely convinced that the events of Harper's Ferry have everything to do with what happened when South Carolina voted a year later to secede from the Union, which occurred right after Lincoln's election, not right after John Brown's execution.
John, so you pointed out at one point in your talk that there was an image of soldiers coming into Charleston, South Carolina.
Yes.
And or Charleston, West Virginia. And
well, that it was in South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Yeah.
So when does the fascination in America begin?
Oh, I don't
John
think
Brown?
in some ways, I don't know that it really ended for those who chose to be fascinated by it. It's something that never really ended. I mean, there's a discussion about the origins of the song John Brown's Body, which for those of you who don't know, it goes to the, we would say goes to the words of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but the Battle Hymn of the Republic was a song that was adopted to the words of John Brown's body, which, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. And there's some indications that John Brown was a sergeant in the state of New York who died, and his troops continued marching even though their sergeant had died. But eventually, the meaning took on just that of John Brown, and so there's that angle to John Brown too. John Brown doesn't have much to do with why states seceded from the Union. But as Civil War soldiers are going through Harper's Ferry, and Harper's Ferry changed hands during the Civil War something like 8 times. they made a point of visiting places associated with with John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, mention it in their letters that went back home. And in that respect, John Brown's meaning, a guy who was using violence to end slavery, was in many respects something that was occurring during the Civil War as the United States Army destroyed the Confederacy.
We have time for one more question if anyone's interested.
Did John Brown in 1859 have a political persuasion?
He was a nonconformist. The only issue that really mattered to him would have been slavery. There's some indications that at one point he might have supported a political party known as the Radical Abolition Party, which nominated Garrett Smith and Frederick Douglass for president and vice president in 1856, and gathered really just no more than a few hundred or a few thousand votes nationwide. Brown's political issue was slavery. So he never seems to have associated with or been involved in any way with any formal political party. Undoubtedly, he would have viewed the Republicans' policy on slavery, of keeping slavery out of the federal territories, as a good thing, but they would have felt that they simply did not go far enough. So in that respect, I think it's better to think of Brown as a radical who's standing outside of a formal political system. And obviously, he didn't have much hope that the formal political system was going to bring about an end to slavery anytime soon.
Thank you all for coming this evening.